So as you can see by that little intro, we're taking a break from our study in the Gospel of John. We're beginning our summer series, and it's called The Shepherd King. And so we're going to look at the life of David in 1st and 2nd Samuel. And you might find it helpful if over the next few months, if you wanted to read through 1st and 2nd Samuel just in preparation and as we journey along, and I think you'll find that very beneficial. David is a very important character in our Bible. He's mentioned outside of the parts of the Bible that are distinctly written about his life. Outside of those, he's mentioned 182 times in the Old Testament and 59 times in the New. And Jesus, in Matthew chapter 12, he says, "Have you not read what David did?" And then he points to the life of David. And in other places, Jesus says, "Have you not read what David wrote through the Holy Spirit?" So Jesus often alludes to the value of knowing about the life of David, knowing what he wrote in getting to know Jesus. Because there's much for us in the Old Testament scriptures that's profitable for us as New Covenant believers if we read it all through the lens of Jesus. Now, Paul, who is one of Jesus' appointed apostles, he writes to his young prodigy Timothy in 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 15. He says, "And how from childhood you've been acquainted with the sacred writings," that's referring to the Old Testament scriptures, "which are able to make you wise for salvation through faith in Christ Jesus." So Jesus and his apostles, they tell us that when you study the Old Testament, it makes you wise. Now, it doesn't make you wise for principles for living, or it's not a blueprint for life, but it says it makes you wise for what? Wise for salvation through faith in Christ Jesus. So in other words, so you'd be wise enough through reading the Old Testament to have faith in Jesus, who's the only true and lasting hope. So Jesus teaches us too that the Old Testament is really all pointing to him. He says this several times in John, in Luke 24, other places. And Jesus specifically then looks back at David. And so even in his title, Jesus' title as Messiah, right? Jesus referred to himself as the Son of David. And he's of the lineage of David. I mean, he was born in David's town, Bethlehem. And he would be like David in many respects. And in the whole New Testament, in fact, in the very first book of the New Testament, the Gospel account of Matthew, it actually begins by saying this: the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. And then later, when we see people, when people are looking and they begin to observe Jesus' life and they see the amazing things he does, they hear the incredible things he is teaching, and when they're astonished, what do they say? They say things like this: "Could this be the son of David?" And when Jesus rides into Jerusalem on a donkey just days before going to the cross, the crowds, they wave the palm branches, throw it down in front of him, and they're crying out what? They say, "Hosanna to the Son of David." They identify him really as the Messiah, God's promised delivering king. And so, well, even if you go to the very last book of the Bible, in fact, in the very last chapter of the book of Revelation, the last book, the risen, glorified Jesus says this, Revelation 22, verse 16. He says, "I, Jesus, have sent my angel to testify to you about these things for the churches. I am the root and the descendant of David, the bright morning star." So that's his identity, right? Jesus links himself continually to David. He says, "I'm the root." In other words, I'm the very source. I brought David into existence. And I gave David his heart and caused him to be who he was. And not only am I David's root, but I'm also the promised offspring from David. I was birthed from David's lineage, and I walk in his inheritance. So, why does Jesus want to identify with David? Especially in light of the life of David, right? Because he's kind of a big screw up. He blows it so many times. So often we see him have these ungodly responses at so many times in his life, and yet we don't see Jesus washing his hands of David. But he actually says, if you want to learn of me, study the life of David. So there has to be at least something in the midst of the mess of David's life, in the midst of his failures, that still gives us a picture of Jesus, our shepherd king, right? A reflection of this greater shepherd king so that we could be actually spurred on to love Jesus more and more. So in order for us to consider David, we have to back up a little bit to Israel's first king named Saul. And so we're going to first look at 1 Samuel chapter 8. And we're going to try and cover 6 chapters this morning. How many think we can do it? One of you, 2 of you. We've got 2 takers on this. Well, let's see how this all is going to turn out, because I don't know how it's going to turn out, but I know we're going to be cutting and pasting here as we go on the fly. If you don't have a Bible, there's still a couple of Bibles on the table over here, and you can just come down and just grab one of those Bibles so you can follow along with us in the book of 1 Samuel, starting in chapter 8. And then if you don't own a Bible, please take one of those Bibles home with you. It's our gift to you. And then we'd encourage you to read about the life of Jesus in the New Testament, as well as the life of David. And you can read through 1 and 2 Samuel. I hope you'll continue to join us as we make our journey then through this account. So we can see that at this point in history, Israel has left Egypt. They've taken possession of, they've settled into at least portions of the promised land. And now Israel is living as a theocracy, which means God is their only king. And he speaks through various forms of spiritual leadership, such as judges and prophets, such as Samuel, who's the writer of this account. And so Samuel was the last judge, and he was also a prophet. So that's our setting. So 1 Samuel chapter 8, beginning at verse 1. When Samuel became old, now I got to say, history actually says, when I was reading this, he was actually my age. And so I'm glad to see at least there's others who are, resistant, a little bit shocked at that as well. Although my wife was nodding profusely in that too. But when Samuel became old, he made his sons judges over Israel. The name of his firstborn son was Joel, and the name of his second Abijah. They were judges in Beersheba. Yet his sons did not walk in his ways, but turned aside after gain. They took bribes and perverted justice. And then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah and said to him, "Behold, you are old." Keep rubbing it in. "And your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint for us a king to judge us like all the nations." But the thing displeased Samuel when they said, "Give us a king to judge us." And Samuel prayed to the Lord. And the Lord said to Samuel, "Obey the voice of the people in all that they say to you. For they've not rejected you, but they've rejected me from being king over them. According to all the deeds that they have done, from the day I brought them up out of Egypt, even to this day, forsaking me and serving other gods, so they're also doing to you. Now then, obey their voice. Only you shall solemnly warn them and show them the ways of the king who shall reign over them." So Israel demands a king who they're pretty sure is just going to provide for them guaranteed prosperity, stability, protect them, prosper them. I mean, with a king, life is going to be easier. So Samuel, as he was told by God, goes on to warn them that actually human kings over them just may not be everything that they desire it to be. In fact, he's going to warn them that these kings will end up oppressing them and using them. God was supposed to be their king. God was supposed to be the one they depended on. But they're like, well, yeah, it's cool and all to have God there, kind of like a safety net, something to fall back on in an emergency. But in the here and now, we got real bills. And we got real enemies who want to hurt us. And we got real social issues that we have to deal with because life is hard. And frankly, we need something more than an invisible God who we don't even know where he is half the time. We need somebody we can depend on, who thinks like us. It's kind of like the single person who says, I know God loves me. I know Jesus is my ultimate spouse, but I want a real live person to hold me. Or like the person who says, yeah, I believe in God, I believe in his promise to provide for all my needs, but I mean, I can't give right now because, I mean, I got to wait till I see how the end of the month works out, got to keep my budget and everything. And God calls this desire for a king right now a rejection of him. And it's not a rejection like, God, we don't want you at all. It is a rejection by saying, God, we don't really trust you. So we demand these other things that we want you to provide for us in addition to you in order for us to be happy and secure. See, irreligious people, they reject God, not wanting him to be any part of their life at all. But religious people reject God by having him be a part of their lives, but not really trusting in him or centering their lives on him. So, I know this doesn't sound very relevant to us today. After all, we'd never be glad to have the invisible God in our life and yet also look to a great marriage, a secure job, lots of money in the bank, would we? So it looks like maybe this story is going to be relevant, at least to me, even if not for you. But for many of us, we treat him almost like more of a safety net. He's maybe more relevant to us when we die. But he's not really who we serve, obey, and depend on in our day-to-day, everyday life. So Israel wanted a king. They wanted a human king because from the very beginning, God had never been enough for them. They never trusted him enough to say, God, I'm just going to do your will, and I'll let you worry about everything else. Because that's what faith would be. No, they want golden calves. They want strong armies. They want guaranteed food and water supplies. They want safe conditions in order for them to feel secure. See, they never outright rejected God. They just complained a lot and found it a lot easier to trust in God when they actually felt like everything they needed was right in front of them, right in their hands. Not just a God they can't see with a word of promise. A God that they can actually control, who doesn't seem to have, my sense of timing, my definition of what's best. That's not really the king I'm looking for. So Israel wants a king. But God says that's a rejection of him because it's a rejection of really trust and satisfaction in him. Without faith, Hebrews 11 tells us it's impossible to please him. And to know God really is to trust him. It's to lean on him. Israel, though, they want a king that they can see, they can touch, they can control because they don't trust God's character. They don't trust his heart. And God calls this rejection because God should be able to be trusted. It's kind of like Abraham, right? He couldn't wait. He had to promise the offspring, everything, all the promises were bound up in this one that he promised to bring. But no, he gets talked into going into Hagar, and they're going to get a child, do it the way he can control it. Or like the prodigal son, right? He wants, no, I'm not going to wait for my dad to die. This is taking too long. Wish you were dead now, but since you're not, just give me the inheritance now. And the prodigal son takes off his inheritance. Or like Lazarus. Remember, Lazarus was sick, and his sisters Mary and Martha. We saw this when we were going through John chapter 11. And Jesus, if you had only been here, my brother wouldn't have died. He'd be alive. But Jesus held off. Why did he wait? Because Lazarus had to die. And then in raising Lazarus from the dead, it says from that point on, that is what led to his death. That led to the death of the cross. And that's because Jesus was also concerned not just about raising Lazarus from the dead, but also Mary, Martha, you, and me. It was that delay that actually led to the cross that saves us, because it was about raising us from the tomb as well. And so you see, there's always something much bigger going on than simply what's happening maybe in the narrow sight of things in your and my life. We can trust his heart. He's got things going on and he's setting things up. But Israel, like often us, want a king now. Now, God did plan for Israel to have a king. In fact, he already told them back in Deuteronomy, I think it was chapter 17, he talks about that he was going to king, but they're not willing to wait for God to provide the right king in God's timing. So God gives them their prayer request. You know what? Sometimes God may give you what you pray for, even to let you learn the hard way that maybe you don't know everything. So if you're single and you're praying, please give me a spouse. I need to be married right now. God may well say, fine, you don't trust me? Here's Mr. Perfect. Enjoy. Because a marriage that starts with idolatry isn't typically going to go very well. Some of you don't realize that in God not answering your prayer, maybe he's protecting you. And if you saw how much his heart was for you, you'd wait upon him. May he never grant us something that will actually allow us to replace him. Now, I need to say, it's not wrong to desire a spouse, not wrong to want that raise, it's not wrong to those things, and even ask God for them. But it's when you crave them and begin to feel like you can't be happy or secure without them, then that's a problem. And here Israel is craving a king. So pray like this: God, I'd love to get that raise, but if not, I trust you to meet my needs. And Samuel warns them, starting in verse 10, of what this is going to mean for them if they actually get this king on their own terms. Now, they're a little idealistic. They just think, here's my problem. This right here becomes the easy solution. But that's often an idealistic way that we can often look at things. But God says, there's so much more. Things are a little more complicated than just that. And so he gives them a bigger picture. In verse 15, he's now giving him the warnings. And so Samuel's warning says, that's the king you'd set over you. He'll take the tenth of your grain and of your vineyards and give it to his officers and to his servants. He'll take your male servants and female servants, the best of your young men and your donkeys, and put them to his work. He'll take the tenth of your flocks and you shall be his slaves. Not exactly what they desired or imagined. And in that day you will cry out because of your king, whom you have chosen for yourselves. But the Lord will not answer you in that day. It's like kind of, right, a year or two after the election. But people refused to obey the voice of Samuel. They said, no, but there shall be a king over us. They're determined that we also may be like all the nations and that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles. So despite all then his warning of the consequences, the people go, yeah, but we still just want a king. If we'd realize sometimes that those who love us, parents, spiritual leaders, friends, right, they may be God's loving messenger to actually help us when we have blind spots. I mean, to them, Samuel just seems like an old stick in the mud, right? He just doesn't understand how times have changed. After all, he's my age. And the irony in this for Israel is that they wanted a king to guarantee them security, safety, and happiness. And what they got was a king who actually took things from them and left them enslaved. And this is true for so many of the kings we look to. And we want God to provide for us these kings, these things, but they end up taking from us. So let's meet their choice for a king. Chapter 9. Chapter 9 tells us that there's a man from the tribe of Benjamin. His name is Kish. And he had a son who was incredibly handsome, athletic. He was a head taller than anyone else, it says, so he really stood out in the crowd. And from all outward appearance, and that's what people tend to focus on, he's just the best human choice. And so Samuel the prophet, he anoints Saul as king over Israel at the beginning of chapter 10 in this official commissioning ceremony. And he sets him apart. And then when they do call Samuel up to the front then, behold, the king of Israel. There's crickets chirping. Behold, the king of Israel. But they can't find him. No one comes forward. And so finally then in chapter 10, verse 22, the Lord lets him know that he's hiding in a storage room. He's behind some baggage. And sheepishly then Saul is just brought forward and presented as the king they all want. He would be their hope for a long, long time. And so they cry out, long live the king. Now, Saul, he seems to be kind of self-effacing. He shyly hides away from the crowds. So he appears very humble, right? But we actually learn as the story unfolds that he's actually very self-absorbed, which leads to his insecurity. You see, pride can manifest itself in a superior way or in an inferior way, being very self-conscious. But both are still ultimately concerned with what other people think. Both are self-absorbed, self-focused. Then in chapter 11, a group called the Ammonites. The Ammonites are people who were pillaging and plundering everyone they could. And so they caused a group of Israelites in Jabesh Gilead to anxiously try to appease the Ammonites and wanted a treaty to be established, even offering themselves to become servants of the Ammonites. But the Ammonite king, he basically just scoffed at them and said, the only way to make a treaty with you is if we get to gouge out your eyes. Wow, where do I sign up? And he sent his armies in to attack Israel. So Saul, when he hears about it, he leads a great victory over these attacking enemies, and he brings, chapter 11 says, salvation to Israel. And then the people, they have this big confirmation party now to celebrate King Saul, right? And the choice they made. And this is really looking good now, right? It looks like they did know what was best and what they really needed when they asked for a king. But then Samuel, he gives this speech at the event. And so picking it up in chapter 11, verse 12, he says, "And when you saw that Nahash, the king of the Ammonites, came against you, you said to me, 'No, but a king shall reign over us.' And when the Lord your God was your king. And now, behold, the king whom you have chosen, for whom you have asked, behold, the Lord has set a king over you. If you will fear the Lord and serve him and obey his voice and not rebel against the commandment of the Lord, if both you and the king who reigns over you will follow the Lord your God, it will be well. But if you will not obey the voice of the Lord, but rebel against the commandment of the Lord, then the hand of the Lord will be against you and your king. Now, therefore, stand still and see this great thing that the Lord will do before your eyes." So he's warning that this was a bad thing, but just because God shows mercy and ends up working out some of these details, well, that's his heart. So you keep obeying and things can go well, but if you're not going to, he then says in verse 17, "Is it not wheat harvest today?" Isn't that all your food out there that you're planning for all the coming year? And I'm sure they're looking over at the fields and the heads of wheat are just plump and they're hanging there all ready for the harvest. And then they're thinking, oh, who invited this guy to the party? And he says, "I will call upon the Lord that he may send thunder and rain. And you shall know and see that your wickedness is great, which you've done in the sight of the Lord in asking for yourselves a king." So Samuel called upon the Lord, and the Lord sent thunder and rain that day, and all the people greatly feared the Lord and Samuel. So this wasn't exactly the celebration speech, the affirmation from Samuel they were looking for. And as everyone's wondering who gave Samuel the mic, he reminds them of their sin, their unbelief. See, we might get what we want when we're actually insistent on getting our own way. We might even get some blessing with it. That's exactly how Israel's feeling, having driven the Ammonites away. But Samuel's saying temporal blessing is not an indication of God's blessing, just his mercy to you in the midst of your sin and rebellion. And then Samuel, he reviews Israel's history, reminding how time and time again God had been faithful, even when the Israelites weren't. You were unbelieving in the wilderness, God gave you manna. You pursued idols. Because of that, God let other nations afflict you. But when you called out to God in repentance, he immediately came to help you and he delivered you. You couldn't ask for a better king than God. He's a king that not only supplies for you, he cares for you, both when you're faithful and he forgives you and has mercy on you when you fail him. Why would you want another king other than God? God pours rain on their harvest, reminding them that Saul might look really great on the outside, but the wind and the waves do not obey him. And nor is his heart and character such that you would want to relinquish and give him power. Saul seemed like such a rock of hope. But pretty soon, popularity and success were shifting Saul from the bashful guy hiding behind the baggage. Now he's got a bit of a swagger he's going to develop in his walk ever since putting on the crown. And he starts taking God for granted, as we'll see. In chapter 13, it's almost like he's put on that ring of power, from the Lord of the Rings trilogy. And the power started to enslave and corrupt him. I could just see him, holding the crown. My precious, And the first obvious shift we begin to see in chapter 13 is when Saul's son Jonathan gains a great victory over the garrisons of the Philistines. And the Philistines are flexing their muscles and they're trying to head out against any of the surrounding peoples. And then when the victory's won, Saul has them blow trumpets, and Saul couches the news. He reframes the narrative in such a way that he gets all the credit for the victory. And then they're about to go into another battle with the Philistines, but Samuel says, as a spokesman from God, he says, wait 7 days, at which time he would then come and he would offer a sacrifice to God to be able to bless their military endeavors. And so in 1 Samuel 13:8, we read, he, that's Saul, waited 7 days, the time appointed by Samuel. But Samuel did not come to Gilgal, and the people were scattering from him. So Saul said, bring the burnt offering here to me and the peace offerings. And he offered the burnt offering. So just as Saul can't wait any longer, right? Because, more and more people are starting to leave and they're going into hiding. So he's seeing his army shrinking. So unlawfully, he makes the sacrifice because he wants God's blessing, even though he's actually about his own agenda. Because sin is always motivated by what's in it for me. It's always asking, what's in it for me? And just as Saul finishes the burnt offering, who comes waltzing over the hill? Samuel. Here he comes. Verse 10, as soon as he, that Saul, had finished offering the burnt offering, behold, would you look at that? Samuel came. And Saul went out to meet him and greet him. Oh, my good friend. He's got to make everything look really good, right? Nothing to see here, right? Quickly shuts off the screen, closes down that window, right? And Samuel says this, what have you done? And Saul said, well, when I saw that the people were scattering from me, here comes all the excuses. That you did not come within the days appointed, and that the Philistines had mustered at Michmash. I said, now the Philistines will come down against me at Gilgal, and I've not sought the favor of the Lord. So I forced myself and offered the burnt offering. See, Saul was able to act for God, but not able to wait for God. He forced himself to act instead of forcing himself to wait and to trust. Can you relate? Saul's walking by sight. Right? He says, I looked around at all the circumstances. Right? The enemy's encroaching on us. The people are scattering, right? And you weren't here to help. So I couldn't wait any longer. Hebrews chapter 11 calls us to imitate those who in faith waited upon the Lord. Saul's not listed there. It's one thing to trust God when you got 3,000 mighty men standing with you, maybe in front of you, maybe behind you. But when you're down to 600 shaky soldiers, then all you got is the promise of God. And Saul in verse 11, he's quick to blame the people for not being there for him. And he's quick to blame Samuel, the spiritual leader, for not being there. You know what? We may not be good at waiting. Come on, some of you don't even wait for the timer to run out in the microwave. A few seconds left, you're stopping it and getting your food out. You can't even wait for the microwave to finish. We're not good at waiting, but we are good at blaming. Blaming people, our spiritual leaders, any authority in our life, others, to justify our sin in response. It's been wired in us since the fall of our first parents, Adam and Eve. And behind that blame is a subtle blaming of God. Subtle rejection of God. And that's because if someone else starts it, we feel we can respond however we want. Right? We justify our response in light of what others do or don't do. And we do this from the time we're kids. He started it. She started it. Why didn't you remind me? You were supposed to help me. My spouse is neglecting my needs, so it's their fault if I turn to porn. Or it's their fault, my spouse's fault, if I turn to this other person to get my emotional needs met. Oh, how blame lets us justify our sin and wrongdoing. After all the miraculous evidence that God had shown Saul, I mean, we skipped over it, but God does some incredible divine coincidences, finding the lost donkeys, setting this up, the casting of lots, all these incredible things. God has shown that he would take care of things, he can take care of things, and he can be trusted. And in spite of God's faithful witness, Saul still takes matters into his own hands. Because not only now is he king, but he's going to take on the role of prophet as well. Not only does he lack faith in God, but he has way too much faith in himself. I see a lot of Saul in me. And that scares me. A guy with a fragile ego that wants affirmation from people. Like, please tell me you like me. And sometimes I feel modest and humble. And when I'm aware of it, I get really excited about how humble I'm getting. And then it hits me. But see, I need to see me the way God sees me. And it's not, I'm just over here, this vile, rotten worm of a sinner. And I'm not just over here, I'm so wonderful and special, Murray, you're a snowflake. You know? But rather, I know I'm broken and I have sin in my life, and yet I'm loved and precious to Jesus at the same time. See, the gospel brings both of those truths together at the same time, which is there to keep us humbly dependent with great confidence and trust in Jesus so we can be assured of the Father's love. And when we find our affirmation in the gospel of Jesus, then we can steward God's love to others for their best and not simply use people to stroke my ego. Well, verse 12 tells us that Saul sought the favor of the Lord. But you see, the favor of the Lord is not sought in simply, it's not found in simply coming to church or offering some spiritual sacrifices that we think God likes, as if we can just buy him off and that should satisfy him so I can get on with my life and just keep him on the margins. See, we don't have to justify ourselves to earn the favor of God. See, that's Saul's mistake. He is right. He needs God's favor, right? We all need the favor of God, but we can't earn it. See, the favor of God is gifted to us in Jesus and nowhere else. He's the king we're truly searching for if we had eyes to see. See, the favor of God's not found in doing, but in trusting and waiting and receiving. Verse 13, still in 1 Samuel 13, Samuel says to Saul, "You've done foolishly. You've not kept the command of the Lord your God, with which he commanded you. For then the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever. But now your kingdom shall not continue. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart, and the Lord has commanded him to be prince over his people because you've not kept what the Lord commanded you." So we see here that Saul's sin was a heart issue. And this foretelling of this replacement king, the one who would be after the Lord's own heart, is in contrast to Saul, who was a man after his own heart. So in this story, in their search for a king, David, who's going to be the replacement king, he's got many great qualities. But as we're going to see as the story unfolds, he tragically disappoints everybody at the end. So then is there no hope? So let's get to the punchline. Spoiler alert. David's story is in the Bible to point you to another king who is coming. And this king would not only be from God, he would be God himself. This way we'd have both God as king and we'd have the best human king possible. So David's story is going to point us to Jesus, the son of David, the king of all kings. And that's where this story applies to you. See, all of us, you see, we're searching for a king. And I don't know what it is your king is that you're trying to look to, but we want something to guarantee us security, prosperity, happiness. And what we're going to see from Saul's life and David's life is that God is the only one who can ever really be our king. Because everything else is going to disappoint. Everything else always overpromises and underdelivers. Anybody found that out to be true? Don't look at your spouse. Keep your eyes straight ahead. But David's story, it starts with Saul then. Both as a contrast and also because Saul is going to be intertwined with David's life as we continue to look at it. And Saul is going to start well, but Jesus, he ended well, faithful unto death. Saul thought of his own interests. Jesus thought primarily of ours. Saul used his power to serve himself. Jesus told us the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve. Saul's selfish, sinful choices would cause many in Israel to die. Jesus' loving choices would cause a people from all the nations to live forever. Israel had to pay for Saul's sins. Jesus would pay for ours. Saul was harsh. He was unforgiving with those who disappointed him. But when Jesus' subjects disappointed and rebelled against him, he laid down his life for them. Jesus is the only king. If you obtain him, he will satisfy you. And whom, if you fail him, which you will forgive you and pay that debt. Astounding. The result of having a king who doesn't have the character nor love of God is devastating. So what I want to offer you today is the choice that Israel did not make. Because the timing now is right for a king. One after God's own heart. One who is God's own heart in the flesh. It's the choice of faith to trust in God's king. Because we have the knowledge of the cross, where there you can see the ultimate display of the character of God, his love, his faithfulness, and in the knowledge of the resurrection, where you see actually God's power to fulfill every promise. So step out in faith and surrender to King Jesus with no demands, no conditions on him, because you trust him. And if God gave himself like that for you on the cross, you can trust him with all the rest of your life, even your death, even your death. Let's celebrate this King as we break bread together.